أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الدين عند الله الإسلام صدق الله العلي العظيم زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, salamun alaikum jamiyan wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A question: how do you ascertain what you believe? How do you figure out what it is that you actually believe? Keep that question in the back of your mind, inshallah, we'll return to it. I want to lay out a scenario for you. The scenario is the following: two worlds, two individuals, two identities simultaneously making a movement. What's the movement? One individual, a Christian by faith, the other a Jew by faith, a Jewish person by faith. Both of them head towards their own respective institutions of religious identity or religious learning. One goes to their house of spirituality, i.e., that is the church, that is the Christian individual, and the person who comes from the Jewish faith or the Jewish background heads towards their respective synagogue. As this movement goes, when they enter into their respective houses, you notice two worlds at odds. What are these odds? You notice at one moment that individual who may come from a Christian background, when they enter into the church, at that same moment, they remove their covering on their head. They remove their hat for the male, for example. They remove their cap. At the same time, someone from the Jewish faith who enters into their synagogue actually simultaneously places the yarmulke or their hat on their head as they enter into their temple or their house of worship. Now, the question which emerges from this is, what just happened? And why did it just happen? If you ask the Christian individual why they did what they did with respect to removing their cap, and you ask the Jewish person why they did what they did with respect to placing the yarmulke on their head, they will have interesting answers. And these answers are worth investigating. So if we ask, for example, the Christian individual as to why it is that they removed their cap when they entered in the church, you may find that they say it is out of respect. Out of respect. Now, if you go to the Jewish individual who just entered their synagogue and placed a yarmulke on their head and walked into their house of worship, and you ask them, why did you place something on your head? And they will look at you and they may very well say, out of respect. Respect for what? Respect for the institution, respect for the religion, respect for the sacredness, respect for the spirituality that may exist within the entity as they believe, for example. How is it possible that two individuals trying to achieve the same goal of respect of their church or the institution have two very different ways of going about it? One is removing, one is placing. You could very easily imagine that you could take the example of the Jewish individual and replace that with a Muslim. Many Muslim men, when they go towards their mosques to pray, they actually put a cap, a kufi cap, or they put a hat or some type of covering on their head when they go towards prayer, when they go towards the mosque. The question that we're trying to analyze at a higher level is, why is it and how is it possible that two individuals, or indeed great nations, or indeed communities, societies at large, can see things in a very different thing, in a very different way, even many times when they're looking at what they perceive to be the same thing? We have been discussing in our analysis, and we began a conversation yesterday on the topic of Islam and modern society, ethics, philosophy, and spirituality. talking about this idea that when I study philosophy, Islamic philosophy, philosophy in particular, in line of the teaching of the Ahlul Bayt, it helps me to get clarity of thought, clarity of mind, so I can make the right decisions. And then the next level is ethics. I adopt the right traits to implement in my life, so I have satisfaction and tranquility in my life. And the third is the kernel, the ultimate goal of having spirituality, a higher sense of being, a higher sense of purpose, a higher sense of consciousness, a higher sense of mindfulness. All of these elements are part and parcel. What we're discussing today is looking at how do we ascertain, how do we actually figure out what it is that we believe? Are our beliefs, are they based on rationality? Are they based on insight? Are they based on other people's opinions? What are they based on? How do we derive them? And based on this discussion, we begin to analyze and see how do the different views in society actually emerge? Why is this important? This is extremely important when we discover many conversations. One of those conversations is Muslims in modern society. And how are these societies? Is there a difference between the two? Is there a convergence or a divergence between the two? Meaning, are the two societies going in different directions, or are they compatible with one another? That's what we want to look at. So the first example that I gave in the onset was this idea of two people, the Christian and the Jew, or for example, the Christian and the Muslim. They may go about achieving one ends, but in two very different ways. And this is an interesting example to look at our world and our society. How do we analyze and how do we ascertain what is truth? What is reality? How can two individuals see things and two communities and two nations see things differently? What may emerge from this conversation is an understanding about and with respect to how our mind actually makes decisions. Allow me to give an example. In psychology, there is a phenomenon known as cognitive bias. That is, due to certain factors that you and I may not be aware of, they may be hidden factors, or at least they may be factors that we're not aware of, we may make certain decisions that we may not have made otherwise. An example to clarify the matter. I remember I was walking down the street in London, uh, perhaps last year, if I remember correctly. And when I was walking down, this happened on several trips, but one of them stood out very particularly. I was walking down the street with some friends and I saw a particular restaurant. And I noticed something about this restaurant. It was, I believe, an Indian restaurant. And in this restaurant, there was a big line actually outside of the restaurant. It was about a block long. But what was interesting is we were actually not intending to go to the restaurant. We were just walking by. As we were walking by, it was very interesting to notice when you peered into the restaurant and you looked in, you noticed that it was actually relatively not that full. It was relatively empty, in fact. And yet there was a very long line outside of the door. Now, there's a few ways to look at this scenario. One may argue, for example, the restaurant may say, as an example, that, well, a lot of these tables are already reserved. There's people who are going to come later. They've already called ahead. They will be here at a certain time. Therefore, the restaurant looks and seems like it's relatively empty, but there's actually, these are for people who will be coming in a few moments, an hour, whatever time. They're reserved seating. That may be one perspective. Another perspective is that this actually may be something called artificial scarcity, meaning people have understood, psychologists and also practitioners have understood that things that are scarce in nature, that is, things that are not readily accessible very easily, are more desirable in society. What's an example of this? An example of this is clearly gold, for example. The value of gold in an economic sense is derived from its scarcity, or at least its perceived scarcity. That is, that how rare it is in society. There's only a certain amount, and there's not a more amount available. That is what essentially makes gold a scarce asset and gives it a value. If it's rare, it's perceived as limited, and therefore there's only a certain amount. If there's only a certain amount, therefore what amount there is, if someone possesses, must have more value. So sometimes there's real scarcity and there's perceived scarcity. Going back to the restaurant example, it may be the case that there are reserved seats, or it may be the case that the restaurant wants to have a line outside so that people who pass by draw their attention to the queue, to the line, and say, hold on a minute, this is a big line, and it must be a reason why people are actually standing in line. And we perceive that because people are standing in line waiting, this must be something that is necessarily good. I gave the restaurant example, but this example happens every single day in various facets of our life. including at the shopping mall, at buying consumer goods. We think for a moment that if something is scarce, it must be good. If something is expensive, it must be good. Whereas data and behavioral science, psychology, economics show that that is not necessarily always the case. Many firms, many companies, especially luxury product companies, they actually create artificial scarcity by saying a very limited supply. There's only 50, there's only 10, there's only XYZ, very small amount of these made. Now, someone who's in this business or this space may be saying that I may be exposing all of the tricks. What my goal here is not that. My goal here is to help understand what are the various perspectives of reality. And understanding that perspective of reality, that same company that creates a shoe that is very rare, for example, could very easily produce many more of those same shoe. But if they did produce many more of that same shoe, the scarcity would go down. And if the scarcity goes down, then the perceived value goes down. Why do I say this? In understanding how we make decisions about our world, one thing that we must understand is the concept of epistemology, which is a fancy term for a simple concept. And that simple concept is, how do we get our knowledge? How do we ascertain what is truth? How do we actually assess what is reality? How this works in the Islamic framework, for example. How is it that we know what we believe to be true? The Quran, the Ahlul Bayt, for example, all of these teachings, there is a process through which it goes in order that we are able to ascertain this as truth. The same is true with respect to how we analyze the world. I should be 100% transparent here. The way I analyze the world is based on my background as well. For example, I come from a world where I've done my undergrad in economics, mathematics, computer science. This informs how I see the world. My world today revolves around, for example, being someone who is working on their PhD in their dissertation, who works in nonprofit, for example, who has a particular worldview. And I am someone who adheres to, for example, the Shia Muslim faith. You can imagine how somebody who doesn't have my worldview, who doesn't have my traits or attributes, for example, someone who, for example, may be an atheist by their faith or lack of faith, someone who is, for example, not college educated, for example, and someone who, for example, has certain values on the political sphere that may not be my values, certain people who believe, for example, science is at odds with modern world. I believe that Islam and science, or religion and science, are compatible in the case of Islam and modern sciences. Someone else may see very differently. You can imagine that the different layers of identity that we have actually lead us to have a different worldview. What's another example of this? A very famous quote came from Silicon Valley from an individual who was analyzing Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley being a term for progress in the form of technology companies, such as Google, such as other companies. You'll notice, bear with me, because this will tie in exactly very closely to our Islamic perspective and how we look at religion and faith, and our faith in particular. Bear with me on this very important point. When looking at society, many people may look at companies such as Google, Amazon, and other similar companies and say this is phenomenal from one perspective. We've had amazing technological advancement and productivity. We're able to analyze and sort the world's data, for example, and we have access to information that we didn't have before. Well, another commentator, when looking at our world from one vantage point or another vantage point, began to look and say, the greatest tragedy of our world is, in fact, the reality that our greatest minds, our smartest people, our biggest intellectuals, the people of Harvard and MIT and Oxford and Cambridge, are working on increasing pay-per-clicks. What does this mean? Pay-per-clicks is the model that certain companies, such as the big companies of the world, such as Google, for example, and similar companies, employed in order to make their income. Now, many times when you and I think that a company has free services, you need to be skeptical of that. Why? Because many times you are the service. Your data may be that service that the company provides to others. And so what was happening was, in order to make marketing companies and businesses actually efficiently use their funds for marketing, the pay-per-click model emerged, where people were able to actually target the exact people that they were trying to reach in terms of their funding. Bear with me here as well. There's an old saying in marketing that 50% of your funds spent on marketing is working and 50% is not. 50% is working and 50% is not. The challenge is you don't know which percent is which side is working, which side isn't. When data emerged that is our data about what our interests are based on what we search on Google and what we search on Facebook and Instagram and all these different platforms, we get a profile. And people who understand, companies understand this profile, and they're able to target individuals. This individual was saying, our greatest minds are working on increasing revenue and making money. This was their viewpoint. The argument he's making here is that our greatest minds should be actually working on something else, as this commentator is saying. What should they be working on? For example, they should be working on our bigger problems, the biggest problems of society. What are those bigger problems? They would say, for example, eradicating poverty. Why aren't these greatest minds going towards eradicating poverty? Why aren't these greatest minds, for example, going towards finding a direct cure to cancer, for example, through computational biology and other subjects? Why aren't they working in the most pressing needs of society? Why are they working, for example, in trying to increase business revenues? And if you go further down those layers, you begin to realize that it may be, for example, that those are the companies that pay the best. If you read a book, for example, by Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, he's commented on this idea that, for example, people talk about how money is actually the driver and the catalyst and has been for religion. He says historical, from the historical lens, that the rulers, they paid the religious class and they were able to, for example, get what they wanted. So the funding accelerated the religious process or kept the religious clergy under a certain umbrella. He says, interestingly, many people don't talk about how science has actually been influenced by funding. Wherever the funding has gone in science, that is actually where the science has thrived, and that's actually where people have gone. So he gives the example, and there's examples that can be cited here. For example, it was in all of the major press in the United States that roughly 50 years ago, the sugar lobby, which is a very organized lobby in the United States, actually paid the New England Journal of Medicine or Harvard researchers to actually divert attention away from the negative impacts of sugar on the heart and focus more on, for example, fat. Now, sugar actually has a negative impact on the heart, but for 50 years, this wasn't researched as a preliminary factor because of the interest of a particular lobby. This is in major public news. This is not something that is a secret. What I'm driving at is these types of biases exist in all of our society, whether we realize it or not. In the restaurant example, you may not realize it, I may not realize it, but we think that because of that long line, that this is an excellent restaurant by default. It may be, or it may not be. We may not be thinking that this is artificial scarcity that's been created. Same with the products. Why am I saying this? We have to look at how do we ascertain what is truth in our reality in our world. One question that many academics get with respect to Islam in universities is, and I'm citing research from Notre Dame University here, that when an introductory course on the Quran and Islam is taken by a secular or non-Muslim individual in a university in the United States, one of the main questions that emerges from that class is, number one, how is it that the Quran, which is the main scripture and text of all Muslims, at the same time looks at a God that is merciful and compassionate, and at the same time has verses that relate to punishment, adab, that relate to, for example, destruction of different civilizations? How is it possible that one God at the same time is merciful and at the same time is destructive? How do you reconcile this? And the researchers and the professors and academics who actually answer this question, they look at certain themes. So, for example, within a secular framework, looking at the Quran, one theme that academics identify about the Quran is something called punishment stories. That is, those stories that are in the Quran that are related to punishment. This is a theme that has been identified by researchers. They say that there's a constant theme within the Quran of stories about prophets who, for example, came, such as Noah, such as Moses, who came forward and they brought a message from God Almighty. They brought God's message and they delivered it. And when they delivered it, the people did not accept it. And when the people did not accept it, as a result, there was a destruction or there was some punishment that was placed on them. Now, notice the terminology and the phraseology that emerged here. They're calling it, or somebody may call it, a punishment story or punishment statement. I may argue that this is not a punishment story. Rather, this is an admonition story, or rather, this is a guidance story. The person who's calling it a punishment story may be looking at the what or the how or what's going on there. The person who's looking at the admonition and guiding is looking at the why. Why is this punishment happening? Well, the reason the punishment is happening is because guidance was sent and admonition was given and was not adhered to. Whereas the person who may be saying this is a punishment story is saying, well, what happened? Well, what happened was punishment was leveraged. But what happened before it that led to that point? So they give various examples. If you look at Nuh alayhi salam in the Quran, that Nuh came with a message and a guidance, and the people did not listen, they did not follow. So God sent his guidance and delivered it through his messenger, through Noah alayhi salam, Nuh alayhi salam. And in that process, he advised the people did not listen, and then there was a massive flood that ensued. One example. The other example, for example, of Musa alayhi salam and delivering the guidance and certain people following it, certain people not following, his people rejecting at times and accepting, certain people being delivered, and Pharaoh, and that whole argument that there was a message. The theme is there was a message that was delivered, people did not follow it, there was a adab. Qawm Lut, for example, or Lot, this idea of fire and brimstone. These stories, for example, the Lot story, which is also found in the Bible, as well as in the Quran, the way that it's looked at based on academics in universities, based on practitioners or people in the Hawz al-Ilmiya, for example, and people, for example, that are lay people from day to day, may be very different. So the question here is, how do you and I get our knowledge? And this is where epistemology comes into play. That is the study of knowledge. How do we get our knowledge, and how is knowledge actually ascertained? There are a few ways. For example, claim testers are one class and one category of how we get knowledge and truth. That is in the philosophical framework. Remember, we're studying philosophy, or the elements of philosophy, as prerequisites to make proper decisions, to understand our world and have clarity about our world. So the first one that one may look at and one may find is intuition. Intuition can be seen as a first filter, a first layer of how do we ascertain whether something is true or not? How do we ascertain or decide if something is knowledge or not? And when you look at intuition, intuition is also informed by the biases that you and I have had throughout our lives. What does that mean? That I have a certain experience that I've lived throughout my life. For example, if you look at the famous quotation of Einstein, where he said, common sense. Common sense is simply, according to Einstein, the collection of biases that we as human beings have absorbed up until the age of 18. Meaning we lived somewhere, we had a certain family background, we had a certain educational background, and these are things that created our view of the world. They may be good, they may be bad, they may be fair, they may be not fair. Intuition is a first filter or first layer. What does my gut feeling say about something? It should be noted that intuition is not enough by itself. That means that I must look at other layers of the equation. Intuition is a starting point. It's not the end all. It's not comprehensive. Number one. The second level of this discussion about what are the claim testers that make knowledge knowledge is looking at authority. Authority refers to experts. What have experts in this field said about this subject? For example, dealing with the coronavirus, dealing with this environment that we're existing in today, we have a world in which there's people who are saying that we should open up societies, open up towns, open up our cities, and no longer should we be concerned about, for example, these lockdowns. We've had enough. We need to make money. We need to take income. They may have a fair argument on one side. There may be other people who are, for example, the experts in this field, who are people who are epidemiologists, for example, people who are experts in diseases, people who are experts in the study of viruses. These people may come forward and say, well, the data shows, the science shows, and the research shows that, in fact, it's not the time to do that, as an example. And we would listen to these people because they have expertise and they've dedicated their lives to these matters and these subjects. The second level is authority, people who have dedicated their lives and understand this concept better than others. There's another layer, which is the third layer of logic. Logic is rational deduction about how I see the world and how I understand things to be the case, based on a proof methodology. And finally, there is actually evidence, the fourth level. Evidence is actually, for example, what you and I would call research papers, looking at the data, looking at the analysis, looking at the world. Now, giving all of these things, I'm going to make it all real with one example very quickly. And that example The same way there's epistemology in the secular sense, there is epistemology in the religious sense. That is things such as burhan, logic, rational reasoning, things of this nature. I say this very importantly because in the early days of Islam, there was a conversation and there was a discussion about the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites, the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ara. These were two groups, one group arguing for predestination and one group arguing for free will. The predestination argument was saying that everything in God's realm has been predetermined. That is, that I don't make any individual decisions on my own. Everything that I do, I pick up a cup of water, I walk, I talk, everything's been predetermined by God. It's bound to happen. The other level of the analysis were those people who are arguing that we have complete free will, meaning that I can make a decision whatever way I want to, and God does not mandate anything upon me. It's total, complete free will. Why is this conversation so important? You can realize the way you see the world, the way you see reality has an impact on how you live in reality. For example, there is a theory that the predestination argument that everything is predetermined was actually self-re-engineered, or it was actually systematically re-engineered in order to legitimize the role of people who are governing and ruling. How? If someone is in power and ruling over a state, ruling over a land, for example, think of, for example, Damascus or the Levant or Sham, for example, in the Islamic Empire. This person is in power. How do they legitimize their power? Because they may not have gotten it through the Prophet. They may not have gotten their position through the Imams. They may not have any religious form or validity to have their belief system. So what do? They use religion in order to meet their ends and stay in power. How do they do this? They hire historians, they hire writers, hire traditionalists to say and create a narrative. That narrative may be along the lines of, well, everything has been predetermined, number one. The entire world, entire existence has been predetermined. And if everything's been predetermined, that means the ruler who's in power right now has been predetermined by God to be in this place because it is in God's knowledge. So everything is predestined. God has knowledge of everything. If God has knowledge of everything, God has knowledge that this ruler who's in power right now was actually going to be in power. Therefore, this person is ruling by divine order. And if the fifth level, if this person is ruling by divine order and you speak out and revolt against this person, then by deduction and analogy, and you go back to the beginning, if this person is ruling with God having knowledge and God's predestination, then you're revolting not against this ruler, you're revolting against the knowledge of God and the power of God and God's decision. And that is punishable by sometimes in death. You can see how this narrative would actually legitimize the undertakings of a tyrant, of a person who is, for example, the likes of a tyrant who did a butchered and did a tremendous atrocity. Let's take Karbala, for example. If you take that example, somebody may come forward and say that because everything's predestined, Allah knew what was going to happen to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and he was fine with it. You can see how problematic this view is in many sense of the words. It would also, in our secular world, legitimize what someone like Hitler, for example, did. You see that there is a balance in society. That's why when our Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam were asked about this matter, such as the sixth Imam, they were asked, what is our position with respect to the predestination and free will argument? They said very clearly, it is al-amr bayn al-amrayn. It is the matter between the two matters. That is, that certain aspects of our lives are predestined and other factors and other matters of our lives are free will. We have the free will in terms of many aspects of our lives, such as, for example, the school we choose to go to, the job that we, for example, choose to do many times, the work we do, the how we spend our leisure time, how we spend our time in general. And there are other things that are predestined that are perhaps beyond our control. For example, what family I'll be born into, for example, what time and space I'll be born into, what zaman and makan I'll be born into. These are things that may not be in my hands and my control. Why is this conversation so important? The necessity and the importance of this conversation is due to the fact and due to the reality that if we don't understand and we don't reflect on how we ascertain our worldview, it's very possible that someone influences our worldview and we may actually lose our religious identity. How's that possible? Imagine for a moment, I live in a world and a society, as an example, where I'm constantly and consistently in academia, for example, and I'm consistently in research, for example, and I'm consistently in the physical sciences. Now, academia has a culture, the physical sciences has a culture. All of these cultures, whether we may realize it or not, have an impact on who I become. If I don't counterbalance that viewpoint, what ends up happening as a result is I actually become someone who is part of that culture and I adopt that culture, that mindset of academia, of the physical sciences 100% wholeheartedly. Even if that says, for example, that the world is atheistic, there's no God, for example, or these views, which is not always the case, but sometimes the case. Why is this important? Because as a Muslim, I believe in a worldview that is comprehensive of this world and a hereafter. And if I don't incorporate the hereafter, I may be at loss in the hereafter. What that means is that I'm not only accountable for justice in this world, I'm also accountable for the hereafter. So, if I, for example, decide to spend my nights in vigil, I decide to spend my night in ibadah, in worship, in reciting the Quran, that is not a waste of time to me. Whereas that may be seen as a waste of time to someone who sees the world in a different way. The point of this conversation was to actually invite you and I to look at what are the sources of our knowledge. How do we get our knowledge? Are we getting it from the right places? And if we're getting it from the right places, is it comprehensively correct, or do I need to counterbalance that with another narrative? It may be, and I have seen this example in my travels many times in my lecturing career throughout the globe, wherever I may be. And many speakers have told me this as well. And this example is very pertinent. I cannot tell you about how many young people I know who were going to the mosque, who were going to religious gatherings, who were part of the culture and the religion of Islam and the Shia faith. And for example, they got into med school, they got into engineering school, they got into whatever university they got to, and it was out of town. And when they got there, when they went to this university, they went there, let's take the example of medicine in the United States. They went there and they studied for four years in undergrad, and then they did another 4 years of medical school. And after that, they went for residency for at least 3 years. That's 4 + 4 + 3, 11 years. All noble pursuits. Medicine, noble pursuit. Education, knowledge, ilm, noble pursuit. Helping others in terms of their health, very noble pursuit. Research, finding solutions to viruses that we're facing, for example, today and other times. All very noble pursuits. But what I'm highlighting is another dimension of the equation, which is I cannot tell you how many emails, how many calls, how many parents have reached out to me over the years and said, can you please have a chat with my son or my daughter about something? What is it? They said that my child was a very religious child, was a very spiritual child, was a very ethical child, was perfect. But they went to university. I say, university, that sounds wonderful. It illuminates the mind. It's fantastic in so many dimensions. Well, they say, well, it's not exactly that. Well, they spent 4 years in undergrad, 4 years in med school, 3 years in, for example, undergrad, in fellowship, for example, or residency. By the way, I'm just using this example. You can very well apply this to engineering or law or many other fields. This is not to be a personal attack on anyone in those fields, by the way. I want it to be very clear. I mean, I could very well use the same application on myself as well. The point that I'm driving at is many people don't realize is they were in one environment before that, but they got separated from the mosque. And they were there for sometimes up to 10 or more years away from the mosque. And those parents think that the child is the same child, their child is the same child that was there the whole time during those 10 years, but they don't realize that they've changed. Dr. Dan Gilbert at Harvard University has done studies on this, and he's found that over a 10-year period, we as human beings, we change dramatically from how we were 10 years ago. If I am someone who's at one stage in my life where I'm 30, 10 years ago, I was a very different person. 10 years before that, I was an even more different person. 10 years from now, in the future, if I'm here, I may be very different. But what he said was interesting is we actually heavily underestimate how much we think we change. We actually think we're pretty much the same. And there is some truth that we do say stay the same, but we also change drastically. What's happening is many of our youth are going off to university, and in that process, when their parents come and tell them, they say, "My son, my daughter, my child, I want you to come to the mosque. You know, now you've gotten your education, everything's wonderful, you've done great, you've been very successful. Come to the mosque sometime. I know you're really busy. Come to the Husainiya. Come to the religious gathering. Come for Shahr Ramadan." They begin to say, "I don't have time for that. That's not a priority for me. I have a lot of other goings on." Why do you want to talk about those fairy tales? This is the type of narrative that emerges, not always, but many a times. Why? Because whether we realize it or not, the world view that we had in the past no longer exists. We've adopted a new worldview. A worldview that, for example, may say only the things that are proven by evidence are true. Whereas there may be things that are philosophically proven, but not empirically, scientifically proven, that are true. But we don't see it that way. That's why we may be losing many youth, or many of not only young people, elders as well. I cannot tell you how many people I've spoken to who would be perceived as elder in society, who have these doubts, who have these questions. And it's not a problem to doubt, but if you doubt, you should also seek out the answers, and the answers are there. Try to understand what is it that helps makes you think what you think, what makes you see what you see, what makes you actually believe what you believe. And you may find there are cognitive biases in these things. And that is why we need a higher being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through his messengers, through his prophets, through his imams, those guides, in order to relieve us of our cognitive biases. This is what Rasulullah did. Rasulullah, when he invited people to Islam, he gave them the message and he said that stop and pause and reflect. Why are you living your life in idolatry, worshiping idols, which you could break them yourself if you wanted to? How are you believing in these stone products that you created yourself that will actually break if you want to break them, that you are more powerful than them? He was opening their minds to look at, where are you getting this from? Stop and pause and reflect on reality. And number two, he was saying, why this class system? That why should you say that certain people are born to rule, for example? He was saying, no. He was saying that, for example, everyone has an equal right. There is no difference between, for example, the rulers of Quraysh or the Meccans and the common person such as Bilal. He said the only differentiating factor is taqwa. This was a worldview. So the idea that we're purporting here is through philosophy, clear thinking, through the proper traits of Islam that lead us to this combination of philosophy and ethics, leads us to spirituality. There is a worldview that we can actually make the world more harmonious, but that starts with understanding why we think what we think. In the next level of conversations, we'll begin to start to talk about what are those things in particular so that we understand that. What are those traits that we can adopt, such as knowing ourselves, such as understanding, man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu, qad arafa rabbahu. The person who understands themselves understands their Lord. This was also something, by the way, that the ancient philosophers looked at. Know thyself was written in Greece in the academy where Socrates was, that was written there, know thyself. So how can we know ourselves so that we can know our Lord? But we need to understand where are we getting our knowledge to have that conversation. I hope and I pray that this has been a fruitful conversation for you and you understand how important this is to chart the future of our community and our society. Inshallah, we'll continue this, life permitting, tomorrow, and we hope to see you again. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.